Hello, and welcome to my channel. Today I'm going to tell you about poor children in Africa and their lives. Sit back, close your eyes, get a bit lost, and drift off to sleep. Please subscribe and leave a comment. There is particular kind of sign of silence that settles over this hell at dawn. Before the heat rises, before the begins its daily migration across cross-cracked earth, before the sounds of a continent waking fill the air. In that silence, if you listen closely, you can hear the footsteps of children. They rise before the sun, not because they want to, but because they must. There are miles to walk, water to carry, fires to start, younger siblings to tend. For hundreds of millions of children across the African continent, child is at a protected season of play and learning. It is the daily arithmetic of survival. Africa, home to more than 500 million children under the age 18. The largest and fastest growing youth population on Earth. P20 fictions from the United Nations suggest that 1 in 3 children born or anywhere in the world will be born in Africa. This is profound demographic reality, and it carries with both enormous potential and devastating responsibility. Because today, the majority of those children live in poverty, not the relative poverty of a developed nation, where poverty means fewer opportunities, but the absolute poverty of a world where children go to sleep hungry, where they walk hours to reach water that may still make them sick, where have never held book or sat in a classroom. The statistics are staggering, but statistics alone cannot carry the weight of what they describe. The numbers tell us that approximately 330 million children in sub-Saharan Africa in multidimensional poverty, meaning they lack access not just to income, but to education, health care, clean water, sanitation, nutrition, and shelter simultaneously. UNICEF data consistently ranks sub-Saharan Africa as the region with high of poverty globally. In some countries, more than 80% of all children are considered poor by these broader measures. These are not exceptional cases. These are the ordinary conditions of childhood for most of the young people. Africa is not a monolith. It wears different faces, speaks different languages, and takes different forms depending on geography, history, conflict, climate, and governance. The child herding cattle across the semi-arid plains of northeastern Kenya faces different challenges than the challenging scavenging in the sprawling slums of Lagos, or the child soldiers who once filled the forests of the Central African Republic. The girls kept from school in the rural highlands of Ethiopia because education is considered unnecessary for daughters. To understand child poverty in Africa, one must be willing to hold many stories at once. to see not a single crisis, but a tapestry of crises, each with its own texture, its owns, its oses, its own path toward resolution. This is the story of those children. It is not an easy story to tell, nor an easy one to hear, but is a necessary one, because the fate of world's children is the fate of the world itself. And there has never been a more urgent moment to understand what is happening to the youngest people on the continent that is home to humanity's oldithies. Part 2.0 in the Earth Historical Origins of African Child Poverty. To understand the present, one must be willing to sit with the past, even the past. The poverty that grips so many African children today did not emerge from nowhere. It was built layer of layer, over centuries. The hands that built it were not always African. For millennia before European contact, the African continent was home to complex, thriving civilizations. The Mali Empire, at its height in the 14th century, controlled more than half of the world's gold supply and housed the legendary city Timbuktu, a center of Islamic scholarship where tens of thousands of students gathered to study mathematics, astronomy, literature, and theology. The Kingdom of Congo, along the Atlantic coast of Central Africa, maintained a sophisticated political system, diplomatic relations with powers, and a highly organized, agronized agricultural economy. Great Zimbabwe rose as a stone city in southeastern Africa, evidence of architectural mastery and long-distance trade networks. Egypt's Nile Valley had already produced one of history's greatest civilizations thousands of years before Rome is even imagined. These were not simple societies waiting to be civilized. In their own right, their own achievements, their own sciences, their own methods for children community. And then came the disruption, the transatlantic slave trade, which began in earnest in the mid-10th century, continued for nearly 400 years, removed an estimated 12 to 15 million people from the African continent. But the true toll was far higher than those who crossed the Atlantic alive. Millions more died in raids, in transit, and in the brutal holding pens of coastal fortresses. Entire communities were devastated. Agricultural systems collapsed. Structures to Brooklyn, corrupted as coastal African kingdoms became entangled in the trade of human beings. The social fabric of vast regions of West and Central Africa was torn apart over generations, leaving wounds that shaped the continent's development for centuries to come. Then came colonization. Between 881, 121, and 1914, in what historians call the scramble for Africa, European powers, Britain, France, Belgium, Germany, Portugal, Italy, and Spain divided the entire continent among themselves at the Berlin Conference, drawing borders with rulers and political ambition rather than any understanding of the ethnic, linguistic, and cultural realities on the ground. By 1914, only Ethiopia and Liberia remained independent of every other African nation. Colonial rule was not benevolent governance. Extraction. European powers built railroads, but those railroads were designed to carry riches out of the continent, not to connect African communities to each other. They built schools, but those schools were designed to produce clerks and servants, colonial administration, not to nurture African scholarship. They imposed taxes that forced Africans to participate in cash economies and labor systems they had never chosen. They dispossessed communities of their land. They broke up systems that had maintained local order and replaced them with structures that served European interests. And in some places, they did worse. The Belgian Congo, under King Leopold II, became the site of one of history's most mented atrocities, with forced rubber collection enforced through mutilation and mass murder. The death toll in the Congo during Leopold's rule is estimated by some historians at 10 million people by the time African nations began gaining independence in the 1960s. They had inherited economies designed for extraction, borders that ignored ethnic realities, institution calibrated to serve colonial masters. And in this, hence has been systematically denied education, land, capital, and self-determination for generations. The legacy of this history is not abstract. In infrastructure, in governance, in debt, in inequality, and in the lives of children born today into communities, stilt by what was done to their ancestors. This is not to say that history is destiny, or that Africa's future is determined by its past. Many African nations have made remarkable strides since independence. Ecology requires acknowledging where the starting line was and who moved it, and why. The poverty of Africa's children is not a natural condition. It has causes, and those causes are human, historical, often rooted in the choices made by people who never set foot on African soil. Part 3. Without food, without water, hunger, malnutrition, and the crisis of survival. Consider the body of a child. A human being in the first 5 years of life, undergoing the most rapid and critical development it will ever experience. The brain is forming connections Epasis would never achieve. The immune system is being calibrated. The skeleton is building its foundational architecture. The gut is learning to process the world. Every cell in that tiny body, inner irrever Franchit,
And
and all of it depends one thing, nutrition. Now consider that approximately 58 million children under the age of 5 in Africa are stunted. Stunting is the clinical term for the permanent physical and cognitive damage caused by chronic malnutrition during the critical or early years of life. A stunted child is not simply shorter than average. A stunted child has experienced damage to brain that reduces cognitive capacity, limits educational attainment, decreases lifetime earnings, and shortens life expectancy. Stunting is not a temporary setback. It is a wound that never fully heals. The causes of childhood malnutrition in Africa are multiple and interlocking. At the most fundamental level, they involve insufficient caloric intake. Children do not have enough to eat. According to the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, approximately 81 million people in Africa experience chronic hunger. In a continent home to some of the world's most fertile land, this is both a tragedy and a paradox. Sub-Saharan Africa contains roughly 60% of the world's uncultivated, arable land. The potential for food production is enormous, yet the systems that might realize that potential, reliable irrigation, access to seeds and fertilizer, functioning markets, storage, infrastructure, transportation networks, are often absent or inadequate, particularly
in rural areas where the majority of the continent's poor children live. Climate change is making this worse. The Sahel region, stretching a continent from Senegal in the west to Sudan in the east, has decades of increasingly unpredictable rainfall, more severe droughts, and
more intense flooding. The Lake Chad Basin, once one of Africa's largest freshwater bodies, and a source of food and livelihoods for tens of millions of people, has shrunk by more than 90% since the 1960s. As the lake recedes, fishing communities collapse, agricultural land becomes desert, and families forced to migrate, disrupting the fragile economic ecosystems on which children's depends. In the Horn of Africa, Ethiopia, Somalia, Kenya, Djibouti, recurring during drought cycles, have created some of the world's most severe acute malnutrition crises. The 2011 famine in Somalia, officially declared by the United Nations, killed an estimated 260,000 people, half of them children under the age of 5. The 2022 drought across the Horn of Africa threatened the food security of more than 20 million people, including millions of children who arrived at emergency feeding stations skeletal, dehydrated, and in urgent need of therapeutic nutrition. In humanitarian triage, when a child is weighed and measured and her circumference is below low threshold, they are given a colored bracelet. Red means the most severe danger. In feeding centers across the Sahel, and the Horn, the red bracelets are worn by and infants whose weight has fallen so far below normal, their organs are beginning to fail. Beyond. Beer is brewed volition. What children eat and what they do not eat. Micronutrient deficiency sometimes calms hidden hunger, affects children who may consume enough calories, but whose diets lack essential vitamins and minerals. Vitamin A deficiency is the leading cause of preventable child blindness, affecting millions of African children. Iron deficiency causes anemia that slows cognitive development and leaves fatigued, and unable to concentrate in school. Iodine deficiency during pregnancy is irreversible cognitive impairment in children. Zinc deficiency immune pairs and increases vulnerability to pneumonia and diarrhea, two of the leading killers of African children. Deficiencies are not caused by a lack of resources in the abstract sense. They are caused by diets built around a narrow range of staple crops. Maize, sorghum, millet, cassava, that provide calories, but not the full nutritional spectrum a developing body requires. And then there is water. The connection between clean water and child survival is so almost difficult. Without clean water, food cannot be safely prepared. Without clean water, hands cannot be washed, and disease spreads. Without clean water, children spend hours each day in the lection rather than in school. Approximately 400 million people in sub-Saharan Africa and Africa lack access to safe drinking water. In many rural communities, the nearest water source is a river. A hand-dug well, or a seasonal pond that may be shared with livestock and contaminated with bacteria, parasites, and agricultural runoff. The child who drinks that water is not ignorant of the risk. Often, there is simply no other choice. Part 4. The shul that is there, exclusion, and the right to learn. Education is not simply a path to economic opportunity. Education is how a civilization transmits itself, how knowledge is preserved, how critical thinking is cultivated, how children are prepared to navigate and shape the world they will inherit. When children are denied education, they are not merely denied employment prospects. They are denied the tools of self-determination. They are denied the capacity to advocate for themselves, to understand their rights, to participate in the democratic and economic life of their communities. Education is, in the deepest sense, the foundation of human dignity. In Africa today, approximately 60 million children of primary school age are not in school. Tens of millions more attend school so irregularly, in conditions so inadequate, that the word attendance barely captures the reality of their experience. A child who sits in a classroom of 100 students, taught by a teacher who he not have received training, who may not have been paid in months, in a building without electricity, without textbooks, without latrines, in a school that floods in the rainy season and becomes an oven in the dry season. That child is, technically, in school, but the education they are receiving is a fraction of what the word implies. The barriers to education in Africa are numerous and sometimes mutually reinforcing. Poverty is the primary driver. In communities where survival is precarious, the immediate labor a child, herding, farming, domestic work, selling in the market, may be more valuable to a family than the future benefit of education, particularly when that future benefit is uncertain, and then the school itself is far away. School fees, even modest ones, can be prohibitive for families living less than $2 a day. The cost of uniforms, supplies, and examination fees compounds the financial burden. For many poor families, sending every child to school is not a choice they can afford. Girls face additional barriers that are distinct and deeply rooted in gender inequality. In communities, girls are expected to marry early, often before the age of 18, sometimes before the age of 15. Once married, they are expected to manage a household and bear children, not to continue their education. The practice of child marriage, though declining in many parts of Africa, remains widespread in West and Central Africa and in parts of East Africa. Niger consistently reports among the highest rates of child marriage in the world, with more than 3/4 of girls married before their 18th birthday. Across sub-Saharan Africa, approximately 40% of girls are married before 18. The consequences for education are immediate and severe. Girls who marry young almost universally leave school, and their daughters are significantly more likely to be married young themselves, perpetuating a cycle across generations. There is also the question of distance. In rural Africa, schools are often far, sometimes 10, 15 away, and especially for girls whose families fear for their safety on long road journeys, the distance alone can be an insurmountable barrier. The absence of secondary schools in rural areas, that even children complete primary education must travel to towns to continue their studies, an option available only to families who can afford boarding or urban accommodation. Conflict and displacement shatter educational systems with particular cruelty. When war comes, schools are often the first civilian infrastructure to be destroyed, looted, or repurposed. In the conflict-affected regions of South Sudan, the Central African Republic, the the Republic of Congo, Mali, and the Lake Chad Basin, means millions of children have had their schooling interrupted for years, sometimes for the entirety of their childhood. The United Nations Education, Scientific and Cultural Organization at conflict affected countries, for more than half all schooled globally, despite representing a much smaller share of the world's child population. A child who misses 3 years of school do not simply return and pick up where they left. Confidence erodes. Many never return at all. Despite these obstacles, something powerful is happening across the continent. Enrollment rates have increased significantly over the past 3. The Millennium Development Goals, adopted in 2000, set a target of universal primary education and sparked significant investment in school construction, teacher training, and the abolition of school fees in many countries. Uganda eliminated primary school fees in 1997 and saw enrollment double almost overnight. Kenya, Tanzania, and Malawi followed with similar results. Today, a majority children do enter primary school, a significant achievement from a generation ago. The challenge is keeping them there, particularly through secondary school and beyond, and ensuring that the education they received to actually transform their lives. Their love. Part 5 of Boys, Breast Risk Disease, Health Care for Girls of Young Lives. Sub-Saharan Africa bears a disproportionate share of the world's burden of childhood disease. Despite containing roughly 14% of the world's population, the region accounts for more than half of all global deaths under the age of 5. Every year, approximately 3 million children in Africa die before reaching their 5th birthday, most of them from causes that are entirely preventable or treatable with interventions that cost only a few dollars per child. Malaria is perhaps the most iconic of Africa's childhood diseases. Transmitted by the female Anopheles mosquito, malaria kills more than 500,000 children in Africa each year, the vast majority of them under the age of 5. The disease is not exotic or mysterious. The parasite Plasmodium falciparum, which causes the most deadly form of malaria, has been known to science for over a century. 5th treatments exist. Insecticide-treated bed nets, which cost only a few dollars, dramatically reduce transmission when used consistently. Indoor residual spraying can eliminate mosquitoes from homes. Yet malaria's because the health systems that would distribute preventive measures and provide timely treatment are inadequate, undunded, simply in the remote rural areas where transmission is highest. A child with malaria who reaches a clinic within 24 hours of the onset of fever can almost always be saved. A child in a remote village whose nearest clinic is 2 days' walk away often cannot. Pneumonia, the single largest infectious killer of children globally, claims the lives of approximately 800,000 African children each year. It is caused by bacteria, viruses, and fungi, pathogens that thrive in conditions overcrowding, indoor, air pollution, malnutrition, and lack of clean water. The children most vulnerable to fatal pneumonias, those who are already weakened by hunger, who sleep in smoky cooking environments, who have never received a pneumococcal vaccine. Again, the knowledge of how to prevent and treat this disease exists. Vaccines, antibiotics, and simple oxygen therapy can prevent the vast majority of pneumonia deaths. The barrier is not scientific. It is systemic. Diarrheal disease kills approximately 300,000 African children under 5 each year, making it third largest cause of child mortality in the region. The link between diarrheal disease and contaminated water is direct and well established. When child drinks water contaminated with cholera, rotavirus, ortavirus, or E. coli, the resulting diarrhea can cause rapid, fatal dehydration. Oral rehydration therapy, a simple mixture of water, sugar, and salt that can be mixed at home, can prevent the majority of diarrhea deaths at minimal cost. The treatment was developed in the 1960s and is considered one of the most significant medical discoveries of 20th century, yet children continue to die from diarrhea because they clean water, because the caregivers may not know how to prepare oral rehydration solution, because health systems do not reach them in time. HIV and AIDS have cast a long shadow over African childhood for 4 decades, while antiretroviral therapy has dramatically reduced HIV-related mortality and mother-to-child transmission since the 2000s. The disease continues to affect millions of African children. Approximately 1.1 million children in Africa are living with HIV. Millions more have lost one or both parents to AIDS-related illness, entering the ranks of what demographers call the AIDS orphan generation. Children who grew up in households, headed grandparents or elder siblings, in communities where the working age adult population had been decimated, where agricultural knowledge and earned income had vanished with the dead. These children faced not only grief but profound economic vulnerability, and the ripple effects of that vulnerability continue to shape communities across southern and eastern Africa. Healthcare systems across much of sub-Saharan Africa are chronically underfunded and understaffed. The World Health Organization recommends a minimum of 23 dogs, nurses, and midwives per 10,000 people to maintain mainly. Many African nations fall far below this threshold. Niger, for example, has fewer than 2 healthcare workers per 10,000 people. In rural areas, the numbers are even lower. Health clinics may lack essential medicines, functioning diagnostic equipment, clean water, and electricity. The cost of care, even in public facilities, can be catastrophic for poor families, leading many to delay seeking treatment until a child's condition has become severe, or to forego treatment entirely. Traditional medicine and informal healers fill some of the gap, sometimes beneficially, sometimes not. Yet the trajectory of child survival in Africa has been moving in a positive direction since 1990. Under-mortality rates in sub-Saharan Africa have fallen by approximately 60%. A historic achievement driven by the expansion of vaccine coverage, improvements in malaria and treatment, better nutrition programs, and the scale-up of antiretroviral therapy. The number of children dying before the age of 5 has been cut nearly in half over 3 decades. This is his progress measured in millions of lives. It is the direct result of investment, innovation, and political will. It is proof that the deaths of these children are not inevitable. Part 6. When violence comes conflict, displacement, and children in crisis. War does particular violence to children. It does not merely kill them, though it kills them in terrible numbers. It disrupts every system that sustains them. It destroys homes, schools, clinics, markets, and water systems. It forces families to flee, often with nothing, into camps and informal settlements where are crowded. Sanitation is poor, food is scarce, and protection is uncertain. It separates families. It kills parents, leaving children to navigate catastrophe alone. It recruits children into armies and groups, forcing them to commit acts of violence that will shape their psychology for the rest of their lives. It creates a generation of children who have known nothing but war, for whom peace is in abstraction and normalcy a foreign concept. The Democratic Republic of Congo has been described as the world's worst humanitarian crisis. A designation it has earned not through a single catastrophe, but through decades of interlocking conflicts that have left much of the country's vast interior in a state of perpetual violence. Since the late 1990s, successive wars in eastern Congo, fueled by competition over the country's extraordinary mineral wealth, by tensions roots in the Rwandan genocide, by the collapse of the collapse of state authority, and by the involvement of neighboring governments, arms, and international corporations, have killed an estimated 6 million people, displaced tens of millions more, and created what the United Nations has consistently ranked as one of the largest humanitarian emergencies in the world. In this environment, children are both victims and, too often, the recruit of child soldiers by armed groups in eastern Congo is well documented. Boys as young as 10 have been abducted from villages, given weapons, drugged, and forced to fight. Girls have been abducted as well, often subjected to sexual violence and forced to serve as domestic laborers for armed groups. Those who survive and escape face profound trauma, stigma, and the challenge of reintegrating into communities that may fear or reject them. South Sudan, the world's newest nation, gained independence from Sudan in 2011 after decades of civil war, only to plunge into a new civil war in 2013. The conflict pitted President Salva Kiir against his former deputy Riek Machar, but it on dimensions that tore communities apart and generated mass atrocities. By 2018, when a peace agreement was signed, an agreement has since been only partially implemented. The war had killed an estimated 400,000 people and displaced more than 4 million. The humanitarian consequences for children were catastrophic. More than 2 million children were severely food insecure. The school system had largely collapsed. Sexual violence was used as a weapon of war on a massive scale, with young girls among the primary victims. Child recruitment into armed forces was widespread on multiple sides of the conflict. In the Lake Chad Basin, where the borders of Niger, Chad, and Cameroon converge, the Boko Haram insurgency, and its offshoot, the Islamic State Africa province, have destabilized an enormous region since 2009. The conflict has displaced more than 2 million people and created one of the world's most severe humanitarian crises. Boko Haram's name, loosely translated from Hausa, Aza, is often rendered as Western education is forbidden, and the group has made schools a deliberate target. In April 2014, the abduction of 276 schoolgirls from Chibok, Nigeria, horrified the world and gave rise to the global hashtag Bring Back Our Girls. Most of those girls were of event released, some after years in captivity. The Chibok abduction was not an isolated incident. Boko Haram has abducted thousands of children across the region, used girls as suicide bombers, and systematically destroyed schools. The result has been the collapse of education across vast stretches of northeastern Nigeria, the Lake Chad Islands, and adjacent territories. Children who should be in school are instead in displacement camps. in hiding, or in the hands of armed groups. The Sahel region more broadly, stretching from Mali and Burkina Faso in the west through Niger and Chad, has experienced a dramatic escalation of violence since 2012, when a Tuareg rebellion in Mali created a power vacuum exploited by jihadist groups. Violence since spread through armed region, with a proliferation of armed groups in communal land, Coverland, and music. Including self unity that includes in schools. Included in schools. UNICEF recorded in 2020 that more than 9,000 schools across the Sahel were closed due to insecurity, depriving approximately 2 million children of education. Teachers have been killed, kidnapped, and threatened. Families have been forced from their homes, and the children who survive carry not just the trauma of what they have witnessed, but the weight of educational deficits that will follow them for the rest of. Part 7. Invisible children, child labor, early marriage, childhoods. There is a category of suffering that is not always visible in the emergency photographs or the dusks of acute crisis. Quieter, more insidious forms of deprivation that unfolds not in moments of catastrophe, but in the slow erosion of what childhood should be. It is the suffering of children who are not dying of hunger or fleeing from war, but who are being required to work as if they were adults. Their futures quite quietly foreclosed before they've had the chance to imagine them. Child labor is one of the most pervasive of child poverty in Africa. According to the International Labor Organization, as has the highest proportion of child laborers of any region in the world. Approximately 2 million African children, in 5, are engaged in child labor, with the majority in sub-Saharan Africa. The largest share work in agriculture, planting, weeding, harvesting, herding in conditions that are often physically demanding, hazardous, and that preclude regular school attendance. Boys work in mining the artisanal gold mines of Burkina Faso, the cobalt mines of the Democratic Republic of Congo, the diamond fields of Sierra Leone and Zimbabwe. The cobalt mines of the DRC are of redolence of relevance. Cobalt is a critical mineral in lithium-ion batteries, the technology that powers smartphones, laptops, and electric vehicles. Investigations by journalists and human rights organizations have documented children as young as 6 working in artisanal cobalt mines in the Katanga region, spending hours in dangerous pits expecting, or that makes its way through complex supply chains to consumer electronics produced by some of the world's largest technology. Girls bear a distinct burden of child labor rooted in the domestic sphere. Across much of Africa, girls are responsible for cooking, cleaning, carrying water, collecting firewood, and caring for younger siblings, often from a very young age. This domestic labor is socially invisible because it occurs within the home, is performed by females, and is considered a natural extension of women's roles rather than recognized as work. But it is work. It occupies hours that otherwise be spent in school. It begins in childhood, and it is preparation, or more precisely, conditioning, for a life in which women's time and energy are dedicated to the service of others rather than to the development of their own potential. Marriage represents one of the most consequential violations of girls' rights in Africa. When a girl is married as a child, and that the vast majority of child marriages globally involve girls, she typically leaves school, begins bearing children before her body is fully mature, and enters a relationship in which she has significantly less power than her husband. Adolescent pregnancy is one of the leading causes of death among girls 15 to 19 globally, primarily. During childbirth, a girl whose pelvis has not yet fully developed, attempting to deliver a full-term baby faces risks that are catastrophic, and that, in the absence of emergency obstetric care, are frequently fatal to the mother, the baby, or both. Obstetric fistula, a devastating injury caused by prolonged obstructed labor, which leaves women with chronic incontinence and often leads to social rejection, is most common in young adolescent mothers in regions with limited healthcare access, particularly across the Sahel and the Horn of Africa. The causes of child marriage are complex and deeply embedded in culture, economics, and gender inequality. In communities where a girl's value is understood primarily in terms of her reproductive role and her capacity to generate bride price, transferred from the groom's family to the bride's family at marriage. Parents may see an early marriage as both economically advantageous and socially protective. In contexts of poverty and insecurity, marrying a daughter off can mean one fewer mouth to feed, a transfer of resources to the family, and a reduction of the perceived risk of a daughter being assaulted outside the protection of marriage. These calculations are not irrational given the conditions in which they occur, but they perpetuate the conditions that make them necessary, bulking girls into a cycle of poverty and restricted agency that spans generations. There are also the children who are simply abandoned, orphaned by the disease, conflict, or parental death from accidents or poverty, and left to fend for themselves on the streets, rapidly growing cities. Street children are among the most vulnerable and least visible members of African society. In Nairobi, in Lagos, in Kinshasa, in Addis Ababa, children as young as 5 or 6 live on the streets, sleeping in doorways or under bridges, eating from garbage, sniffing glue to dull hunger and fear, vulnerable to exploitation, trafficking, and violence. Many of these children have some family somewhere, but have been pushed out, unable to afford school fees, unwelcome in stepfamily households, rejected after the disclosure of abuse. The streets offer freedom of a kind, freedom from specific exploitation, but exchange it for the pervasive danger of a world with no protection at all. Part 8. The geography of hope, what is working, and it matters. The story of African child poverty is not only a story of suffering. It is also a story of extraordinary resilience, creativity, determination, and change. Over the past 3 decades, the number of people living in extreme poverty, Africa, declined as a share of the population, even as population has grown. Child mortality has fallen dramatically. Primary school enrollment has increased significantly. The incidence of several major childhood diseases has declined. Life expectancy has risen. These are not statistical abstractions. They represent millions of children who are alive and learning because something changed. Because a vaccine was delivered, a bed net was distributed, a school was built, a law was changed, or a community decided that things could be different. Rwanda, one of the most striking examples of transformation in recent African history. In 1994, Rwanda was one of the 20th century's most terrible atrocities, a genocide in which an estimated 800,000 Tutsi and moderate Hutu were killed in 100 days, systematically and with deliberate cruelty. The country was shattered. Its institutions, its economy, its social fabric, and its children had all been traumatized beyond what most observers thought recoverable. Yet in the decades that followed, Rwanda rebuilt with remarkable speed and intentionality. Today, it has some of the lowest rates of child malnutrition in Africa, one of the highest rates, one of zentation in the world, and a healthcare system that has dramatically reduced child mortality. Rwanda's transformation is not a simple story. It involves authoritarian gun governance alongside genuine development achievements. Questions remain about political freedom. But as a case study in the possibility of recovery from poverty, it is impossible to ignore Ethiopia, home to more than 120 million people, and one of Africa's fastest growing economies over the past 2 decades, has made striking progress on child health indicators. Under 5 mortality in Ethiopia fell 204 deaths per thousand live births in 1980 to 5 per thousand by 2019, a reduction of nearly 75%. This was achieved in large part through the deployment of a new covenant of community health workers as extension workers, predominantly women, who receive basic training in preventive care, immunization, and maternal health, and who work in their own communities rather than in distant clinics. By bringing healthcare to the community level, Ethiopia dramatically increased reach of its health system, the requirements of hospice care. This model has been studied and replicated across Africa. In West Africa, the expansion of mobile banking and mobile payment systems has created new economic opportunities for people who were previously excluded from formal financial services. Platforms like M-Pesa in Kenya, which began as a mobile money transfer service in 2007, and now processes more transactions than the country's traditional banking system, have allowed smallholder farmers to receive payments, store savings, and access credit in ways where it were previously impossible. Economists studying M-Pesa have found that access to mobile banking lifted approximately 2% Halsa out of poverty. With the Lavis, gravestone headed households. For families with children, greater financial resilience means a greater ability to absorb shocks, a bad harvest, an illness, the death of a family member, without falling into crisis. Community-led initiatives across Africa are demonstrating that the solutions to child poverty often exist within communities themselves, requiring not external charity, but support, resources, and the removal of barriers. The Barefoot College in India, which has been replicated in multiple African countries, train rural grandmothers, many of them illiterate, to install and maintain solar power systems in their villages. In Senegal, Sierra Leone, and other countries, these women have brought electricity to communities that had never had it, enabling children after dark health clinics to refrigerate vaccines. It is a model built on the premise that people living in poverty are not passive recipients of the love. Passive recipients aren't transformation. Education remains the most long-term lever for change. Studies consistently demonstrate that each additional year of schooling, being for a girl reduces her likelihood of marrying as a child, reduces her number of children, improves her children's nutrition and health outcomes, and increases her lifetime earnings. The returns to girls' education ripple through generations, compounding in ways that no single intervention can match. countries that have successfully reduced child poverty. In Asia, in Latin America, and increasingly in Africa, have almost universally done, in part through dramatic expansions in girls' educational attainment. The evidence is unambiguous. Educated girls become healthier mothers, earn more income, in their children's futures, participate more actively in civic life. Educating girls is not simply a matter of justice, though it is certainly that. It is the single most active investment in its own future. Voice from the grounds, Storen, families and communities in the northern Kenyan town of Marsabit. A drought that stretched across 3 years had by 2022 reduced the pastoralist communities of the region to a state of acute crisis. The cattle and goats on which families depended for food and income had died in the thousands. Water sources had dried up. Children were arriving at emergency nutrition centers with visible signs of severe acute malnutrition. Ribs showing through skin, eyes sunken, limbs thin as sticks. Among them was a 3-year-old girl whom aid workers named Grace. She had walked with her grandmother for 2 days to reach the feeding center. That by the time Mid arrived, her mid-upper arm circumference, the measure used to assess acute malnutrition, was below the threshold that indicated a life-threatening condition. She received therapeutic food, treatment for an infection, and careful ring. 3 weeks later, she was walking, then running, then laughing in the camp's small play area. Grace Stories is not unique. It is the story of thousands of children in that season, in that place. Some of them made it. Some did not. In the Kakuma refugee camp in northwestern Kenya, one of the world's largest and oldest refugee camps, to more than 200,000 South people from South Sudan, Somalia, Ethiopia, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and more than a dozen other countries, children make up more than half the population. They arrive with their families, or sometimes alone, having survived journeys of violence and deprivation that no child should ever face. In Kakuma, the conditions of the camp are themselves challenging. Overcrowding, limited food rations, water shortages, and the grinding monotony of years and sometimes decades spent in a temporary settlement that, but by necessity, a permanent home. But within the camp, something remarkable has also taken root. Schools have been built, teachers, many of them refugees themselves, have been trained. Generation of children who arrived with nothing to read, to calculate, to reason, to dream. Some of them have gone on to university. Some have become doctors, engineers, teachers. The camp produced young people who will rebuild their countries when peace finally comes. In rural Malawi, one of the world's poorest countries, pets of trisomo. The tradition of allowing girls to participate in initiation rates that often include sexual activity with older men was, until recently, widespread in parts of the country. Young girls, sometimes as young as 12 or 13, were sent to sexual cleansers, men who were believed purify girls through sexual intercourse as part of initiation into adulthood. The practice exposed girls to HIV, unwanted pregnancy, profound psychological harm in 2016, largely through the advocacy of a local community leader named Teresa Kachindamoto, the senior chief of the Dedza district. Hundreds of child marriages were annulled and traditional leaders were persuaded to sign agreements banning the practice and the harmful initiation rites associated with it. Kachindamoto, working within the traditional authorities of her community of Chudi, achieved in months, what external advocacy had failed to accomplish for years. Her approach offers a model change within communities, led by community members, grounded in cultural authority and genuine relationship. In the streets of Accra, Ghana, are called girls. Aid has for 3 decades provided education, vocational training, and safe shelter for girls who have been living on the streets, young women who arrived in the city from rural areas seeking work, or who fled abuse, or who were abandoned. Many of them had never been to school. The program teaches literacy and numeracy alongside practical skills, tailoring, catering, beauty services, and provides a structured environment in which young women can rebuild of self-worth and possibility. The graduates of Street Girls Aid have gone on to start businesses, raise healthy children, and become community leaders in their own right. The program is small in scale relative to the enormity of the problem, but it demonstrates what is possible when girls who have been discarded by systems as are treated as individuals of value and potential. These are stories specificity of particular children in particular places with particular lives. They resist the abstraction of statistics. They remind us that the global numbers, 330 million children in multidimensional poverty, 60 million to schools, 58 million stunted, are not population data. They are aggregations of individual human beings, each of whom has a name, a family, a story, longing for the kind of ordinary life the most of the world's people take for granted. The child walking miles for water in the Sahel wants what your child wants: to play, to learn, to be safe, to be loved, to grow up and become someone. Part teen. What the future holds: demographic change, climate, and the path forward. The African continent stands at an extraordinary inflection point. By 2050, Africa's population is expected to reach approximately 2.8 billion people, with the youth population, those under 25, constituting the majority. This demographic reality is sometimes as a youth bulge, a term that carries in it both promise and anxiety. The promise is of a working-age population, large enough to power economic growth at a scale that could transform the continent and the world. The anxiety is of a generation of young people without education, employment, or opportunity, a generation whose frustration and displacement could fuel conflict, migration, and instability for decades. The outcome will depend, more than any other single factor, on what happens to Africa's children right now. The children being Africa today will reach working age between NC 35 and 2035 and 2050. Whether they arrive at adulthood with the health, education, and skills to contribute to their economies and communities, or whether they arrive stunted by malnutrition, truncated by early marriage, excluded by inadequate schools, and traumatized by conflict and displacement. And displacement will be determined by choices made in the next decade by African governments, by international donors, by communities, and by the global economic and political systems in which Africa is embedded. Climate change poses perhaps the gravest long-term threat to Africa's children. And it is a threat that Africa bears disproportionately, despite having contributed at least to the greenhouse gas emissions that cause it. The continent accountants approximate 4% of global carbon dioxide emissions, less than any other inhabited region on Earth. Yet Africa is projected to experience some of the most severe effects of climate change. More extreme, more intense flooding, rising sea levels that threaten coastal cities, shifts in disease patterns, and disruptions to agricultural systems, technical systems that tens of millions of people depend on for. Climate models suggest that without significant global action to reduce emissions and the Horn of Africa could become functionally uninhabitable by the end of century, driving mass blast displacement at the scale the world has never seen, with children at the center of that crisis. The moral, practical case for global investment in Africa's children's, upon examination, overwhelming. The cost of inaction in humanitarian emergence, in health crises, in conflict, in lost potential, dwarfs the cost of investment. Studies by the Copenhagen Consensus and the Lancet Commission on Investing in Health have demonstrated that interventions age health and in child health and nutrition yield returns of between $5 and $100 and one economic benefit for every dollar invested. Returns driven by the increased productivity of healthier, more educated workers the reduced healthcare costs of preventing disease rather than treating it, and the compounding benefits, breaking intergenerational holes of poverty. Educating girls, in particular, has been calculated to generate economic returns that rival those of any other investment a society can make. The architecture of international development, the systems of aid, investment, trade, debt, governance through which wealthy nations engage with poorer ones, is itself in need of transformation. African nations collectively pay more in debt service to national creditors than they receive in development assistance. Trade rules that protect agricultural subsidies in wealthy nations make it harder for African farmers compete in global markets. Illicit financial flows, money leaving the continent through the corruption transfer by multinational corporations remove approximately $80 to $90 billion from Africa each year, a sum that exceeds the total foreign aid to the continent. These are structural realities, and they are amenable to change through political will and international negotiation. None of this diminishes the responsibility themselves. Governance quality, institutional integrity, the prioritization of children's welfare in national budgets are critical determinants of outcomes. Countries that have invested consistently in basic services, healthcare, education, sanitation, and have achieved far better results for their children than those that have not. Even at similar income levels, the evidence, it is clear that political leadership, not up wealth, determines whether children thrive or suffer. What the future holds for Africa's children is not written, it is being written now, in the choices made by parents and policymakers, by international institutions and local communities, by donors and debt holders, by the children themselves, as they grow and organize and demand more for themselves and their peers. The arc of history bends slowly, sometimes agonizingly, toward greater justice. The children walking in the African dawn have not yet been what their world, neither of have we. Part 11. A continent's children, the world's responsibility. Closing reflections. We begin with the silence before dawn, the sound of small feet in the darkness, rising to meet a world that has not yet made adequate space for them. We end there too, with those children still walking. There is a temptation, when confronted with the scale of suffering described in these pages, to feel overwhelmed into passivity. The Prompligen problem is too large, too complex, too deeply rooted to be addressed. This temptation must be resisted, not because the complexity is illusory. It is entirely real. But the evidence is equally clear that things can change, and that things do change, and that they do change when the will and resources are sufficient. Consider the trajectory of poverty globally. In 1990, nearly half of the world's people lived in extreme poverty. By 2015, but figure had fallen to less than 13%. A reduction that constitutes one of the greatest improvements in human welfare in recorded history. The primary driver of that reduction was economic development in Asia, particularly in China and India. Africa did not participate in that transformation to the same degree. And that is part why the concentration of poverty there is now so stark. But the reduction in Asian poverty happened because conditions changed, because investment was made, because governance improved, because education expanded, because relationships shifted, because children in those countries began to receive the nutrition, health care, and schooling they needed to grow into productive, healthy adults. What happened in Asia can happen in Africa. The ingredients are not mysterious. The children of Africa are not defined by their suffering. They are defined by everything a child is: ears, curiosity, laughter, the desire to play and to learn and to be recognized and loved. They are defined by the extraordinary human capacity for resilience, which allows to survive conditions that should not exist, to carry within themselves something worth preserving. The 4-year-old in the therapeutic feeding center recovering from malnutrition, Christian, who reaches up and grabs the finger of the nurse weighing her. She is not simply data point in a humanitarian crisis. She is a person. She has preferences and reactions, and the beginnings of a personality. She has people who love her. If the world will allow it, Every major religious tradition, every philosophical system of ethics, and every framework of international law agree on least one thing: children deserve special protection. Cannot protect themselves. They cannot advocate for themselves where decisions are made. They cannot vote or lobby or buy influence. They depend on adults, on parents, on communities, on governments, on international systems to make choices that serve their welfare. When those adults and systems fail them, the failure is not the children's. The story of Africa's poorest children's ultimately a story about us, about the kind of world we are collectively choosing to build or to tolerate. It is a story about the values we enact through our institutions, our trade relationships, our military adventures, our climate policies, and our willingness to look uncomfortable truths without looking away. The children in these stories did not choose the circumstances of their birth. They did not choose the history that shaped their world, the governments that govern their countries, the climate that threatens their harvests. or the international cysts, that determine their access to resources. They were born into those circumstances. As all of us born into ours, the difference is that their circumstance are many a matter of vath, and that between their circumstances and ours is not natural, not inevitable, and not acceptable. As the story comes to its close, the dawn is breaking again somewhere across the African continent. In a village in the Sahel, a girl is waking before the sun to begin the walk to the well. In a refugee camp in Kenya, a boy is pulling on a uniform and reviewing notes by lamplight the night before. In a hospital ward in Kinshasa, a nurse is carrying a malnourished infant. Infrib on life is still uncertain. In a schoolroom in Rwanda, a teacher is chalking equations on a blackboard while children bend over their notebooks in concentration. Are not separate stories. They are one story, the story of a continent's children living the realities that history and geography and human choices have given them, and reaching all of them for something better. They are reaching for what all children reach for. The question is whether we will reach back.